Subscribe to Need to Know for the CEO podcast, and you will get to listen to and be inspired by other CEOs as they share their experiences and best practices. You'll also get to listen to subject matter experts who will brief you on what they think you need to know to do your job more effectively. The experts will occasionally include Ian and I, who will do episodes on topics like creating a winning strategy, OKR best practices, maturing metric capabilities, and building a high-performance culture, and other business news-related topics. Enjoy the show. Hi, Ian. It's time for us to chew the fat on another topic that's popular that we get asked all the time. Today is KPIs versus OKRs.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly one of the topics I get asked about the most. I seem to have written multiple blog posts about. I engage in many conversations in LinkedIn, and yet I think there's still quite a lot of confusion and misunderstanding about it.
Absolutely. It's no surprise that maybe there's 20 to 30,000 searches a month, believe it or not, on in Google just on this term alone. Is it the right question, do you think?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. It's a reasonable question because organizations often use these terms, but I don't think it's the right question. I think a better question is, how do we optimize how we use metrics?
Yeah.
And OKRs and KPIs are both metrics. That to me is the real heart of the question.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go deeper into sort of metrics. Obviously, people will be familiar with the term KPIs as well. So obviously, KPIs tend to be more strategically linked key performance indicators, clue in the name. Metrics are often used for more operational numbers associated with processes and activities. But essentially, we're talking numbers, right? Numbers that mean something or are significant to the business or the team. And some of the things that we do in our coaching is really help teams understand that there are different types of metric, and they fall into the category of sort of different types of analytics as well. So, for example, strategy or strategic KPIs are really all about what do we want to happen. So, of course, we want revenue to increase. We want your customer-centric KPIs to improve. We want you to be able to deliver your strategy. Maybe that's a view of your strategic North Star. We want to be able to do something called descriptive analytics, which describes what happened. So there we're really looking at things like trends. So, for example, perhaps customer purchase frequency dropped. If it did drop, we want to know the cause. So that's called root cause analytics. So why did that happen? So perhaps the returns rate went up. And maybe if you dig into that, maybe it's items stop fitting. So what is going to happen next? Well, that's predictive analytics. So maybe lifetime value will drop, or maybe cost per acquisition will rise. And then we get into really prescriptive analytics. What should we do next? And maybe this is where you create hypotheses, or you have actual data to say this is what we would do in that situation. So, for example, if we were a fashion brand, it feels like that's what I was describing there. It might be that we increase the number of people who see your fitting information, your sizing charts, etc. So it's of course we want to simplify things, but it's nuanced. We use them for different reasons. They do different jobs, and all of that data and all those different types of analytics are really there to tell stories.
Yeah, that's a great way of describing it. And the idea of a narrative, I think, is becoming more common, certainly in strategic circles, but across business as a whole. I've heard business leaders described recently as storytellers.
Yeah,
and metrics are a big part of the story. I think what I'm hearing there as well is there's a clear set of relationships between metrics. Is that they don't exist in isolation. You talked about your hypothesis around people seeing a sizing chart so that we reduce our returns rate. And when we think about metrics, I think it's those relationships that we're trying to identify. And I don't know about you, but I think what is also interesting is a dimension to those kind of relationships. There's, how confident are we that one lever drives another?
Yes.
And I'd imagine in that example you've just used, the confidence is relatively low, but we may have some data to check that hypothesis.
Yeah.
But there's also the strength of the influence. Would a 20% increase in people looking at the sizing chart lead to a 20% drop in returns? Yeah. Maybe not. So those two extra dimensions are really worth kind of thinking about. And this whole idea of relationships is really at the heart of metrics.
Yeah, and experimentation, and that sort of being able to state things as belief is, as you know, important for achieving OKR maturity as well as metric maturity.
Yeah, 100%.
So there are some real core use cases behind KPIs and metrics. So one that we're obviously familiar with, and if you're used to OKRs, that idea of dashboards or health metrics, that kind of view as of a team or an org or a cross-functional group as to how healthy are they at any one point in time, and being able to track that, which is also really useful. And the kind of probably one of my favorite use cases is for onboarding somebody into a team. Why does this team exist? Why is it here? How could you help? What are we acting on? And what would success look like? So they're really important things. Of course, groups of metrics and levers can then be used for forecasting. I mentioned root cause analysis as well, but perhaps, in the context of what we're here to talk about today, which is OKRs, really good OKRs in a metric mature organization are really often targeting those root causes, those prescriptive metrics, and in order to predict something. So for example, if we were confident that acting on a time to quote metric, which was the root cause problem and is what we prescriptively want to act on, was going to influence, for example, a B2B close one ratio. And we predict that by doing that, we're going to, that close one percentage will increase as a driver of revenue. We're able to both describe in the lever what we're trying to act upon and what we predict will happen as a result. And that creates that kind of effect of two balancing key results. And that would make what is likely to be an incredibly strong OKR. In a more mature, in an immature organization, I should say, they're more likely not to be able to do that. And they're more likely to fall into the trap of describing the work that they're going to do without ever really knowing the outcome. So it's important to have those use cases in mind, because they're incredibly strong use cases as they relate to performance.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And this idea of maturity and OKRs is something that I think we've talked about a lot. We talk to our clients a lot about, and it's really interesting that that idea of metrics being at the heart of an organization and the heart of a team. The best teams I've seen, as you know, I kind of talk to a lot of product teams, have really had metrics at their fingertips. And I think back to how many times have I joined an organization and been shown, here are the levers that we think we can see, here are the relationships between our key metrics. Not very often. So that use case you talk about there is bringing on board new starters and articulating what we're about as a team. I think it's fantastic. I love that example.
So obviously the headline here is KPIs and OKRs. So I think it's probably reasonable to do the equal exercise, or the equivalent exercise of basically describing what OKRs and what OKRs are to you as a renowned expert in the field.
Yeah, absolutely. So to me, I describe OKRs as a point in time goal. So there's something we're trying to achieve over a period of time, often quarterly, but that's flexible. And they constituent parts are two constituent parts. There's the qualitative objective, which is a statement of what we're trying to achieve. And that's paired up with key results, which help us measure progress towards our goal. And it's kind of interesting for me because throughout my career, I've asked, these two questions: why are we doing this, and how will we know we've succeeded? And at some point, a few years back, OKRs came along and they framed those questions really nicely for me. And that's at the most simple level. And what bring into key results a little bit, because that's the metric part of an OKR. Now, what for me a key result is is what I describe as a measurable beneficial effect for someone. And that can be ideally for a customer. So we're looking to make a customer's lives better because that's generally how we succeed as a business.
Mm.
But they can be what we call outcomes for the business themselves, or even sometimes stakeholders.
Yeah.
Let's say a team's charged with improving a supplier's life or an employee's life, or even we want to have better corporate responsibility about the environment. Those are stakeholders, and we can build OKRs around those. And the key thing there is this measurability. That's absolutely crucial. And as organizations become more mature, what they realize is that great OKRs tend to act on what we call leading metrics. Now, we're referring back to our statements a few moments ago about metric relationships.
Mm.
And generally speaking, the things that we care about in business in the longer term, revenue, profit, these are lagging. And great organizations find a kind of metrics connection between those lagging measures and leading measures.
Yeah.
And leading measures are things that we can influence in a reasonable time frame. The natural conclusion being in the time frame that your OKRs are set for.
Yeah.
So that's where maturity is really starting to come in for OKRs, when you start to understand that leading metrics or creating leading metrics is crucial. And then that connects into, about going into rabbit hole here, it connects into this idea that I talk about a lot, which is kind of short feedback loops, because leading metrics are much more amenable to that kind of approach.
Yeah. And I think for me, there's sort of building on your description there, what I really like about them is that they are able to communicate the what you're committing to achieving and the why, and providing you with a stake in the ground as to what success looks like. And then you can really engage teams and everyone in the org, should you want to, around rallying them behind that. It's an energizing entity as well as kind of a very rational planning entity. It should be able to kind of encapsulate ambition and direction. It should be able to kind of really generate some energy and some commitment behind what you're trying to achieve. And that then sort of people can lean into these things. You can improve culture with transparency, line of sight of impact, and other benefits that the framework bring.
Yeah, so I love this idea of this kind of inspiration behind OKRs. And I think it was Sergey Brin at Google who said, the best OKRs make us feel uncomfortably excited, which is, in 2 words, captures quite a lot. It's clearly something we care about.
Yeah.
It's something that we feel if we achieve, it's going to make a difference.
Yeah.
But we also know it's not easy.
Yeah.
And great OKRs have that quality, that really nice pithy statement. So absolutely 100% agree with you there. And
what was obvious in you saying that is they're not business as usual. They're not your everyday to-do list. They're not your everyday processes that you're following in order to do your job. These things or these entities stand out as being the few things that we're committing to resource and achieve in order to move the needle on something that's really important, which is often strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And in those metrics, we're starting to get at the hub of the difference really between OKRs and KPIs there, and what they're for.
Of course, and those key results, if you're a metric mature organization, are that method of tracking progress, providing that real focal point for those weekly conversations. And you and I talk about the chances of you succeeding as a company, as a team, as an organization, and with a framework like OKRs is highly dependent on your capability and your commitment to those weekly conversations.
Yeah, absolutely, Hank. First part of that statement, a bit about focal point. We need very few OKRs, and sometimes I like to think of metrics as a pyramid.
Yeah,
and at the very top, the smallest amount you have OKRs, because they represent your most significant strategic focus.
Yeah,
and by nature, there should be very few of those. So I think that's absolutely crucial. And in terms of in terms of this weekly conversation, I think these things connect really closely. If this is the most important thing your organization's working on, how can you not find at least a little bit of time every week to talk about them?
Yes.
And it's amazing how often teams struggle because really they haven't narrowed it down, they haven't focused enough, and they haven't identified the really critical things that are going on.
Or what I often find is they haven't resourced it. So the reason why they don't want to talk weekly is they've not been working on it. And that, when you're signing off or committing to an OKR, one of the key processes behind that is obviously to, make sure you've got the people, time, money, resource, you've cleared the decks in terms of, you've got the people you need available to actually make progress or sufficient progress. And without that, these important critical goals can be left to wither on the vine quite happily. Therefore, your incentive to talk more frequently goes down, and it's pretty demoralizing, right? If you're not making progress on the things that you got excited about in those workshops, your head can drop. And what always amazes me about the workshops that we run is if you could bottle the energy that's in that room at the end of the 1, 2, 3 days, whatever we're doing, you could power a whole company for a year.
Yeah.
Not losing that momentum, not losing that commitment and that excitement from the kind of day one post those sessions is incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you see in those situations is the conversation quickly goes from an OKR conversation is about what we're achieving, and they're about building confidence that we're going to achieve what we need.
Yeah.
What happens when you haven't got the right focus is the conversation reverts quite quickly to what we're doing, and a big focus on what I'd call project management rather than outcomes focus. And that's, it really depends on also the starting point for the organization. If you've got already got a cross-functional team and that team is now working with OKRs, it's easier than if you're creating a new team from scratch for the OKRs, because there's often a kind of backlog of stuff that people are working on, which doesn't just go away. So that can be a challenge as well for organizations. It's that starting point. Absolutely.
So you and I have both worked in product management, to name but a few different jobs. The jobs to be done framework is something we're both familiar with and really like. It's a lovely way of framing what we're trying to achieve. In the context of KPIs or metrics, should we just sort of maybe think about some of the jobs that are there to be done to help sort of really sort of provide context for this separation between OKRs and KPIs or metrics?
Yeah, I do love. I do love this framework, because when I think about the clients, we've worked with over, I've worked with over the years, there's this great question I always ask is, okay, what job are you trying to do with OKRs? And it's incredibly revealing. But if you then look at that in the context of metrics generally, what do you use metrics for? I mean, some of the things that spring to mind is, okay, they tell us how healthy our business is.
Yes.
And the very most obvious, the most simple metric is profit, followed closely by revenue.
Yeah.
They also, and to the other end of the business, which is on the strategy side, to help us understand what levers we have to achieve our goals, which is incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
I think connecting a little bit to your point about the onboarding people and communication, they also help us visualize our strategy. They help us communicate that. They help people understand. We all learn in different ways. And they're also helping us make a journey really from this kind of opinion-based decision-making. I don't know if I'm sure you've heard of the term HIPPO, highest paid person's opinion. Let's decide what to do based on the evidence at hand. They help us make that journey, closely linked to that testing hypotheses. And then getting more into the OKR kind of world, they help us set meaningful goals.
Yeah.
So OKRs are all about metrics.
Yeah.
They help us kind of set, okay, what's our target for the next 3 months? What are we going to achieve? And metrics are at the heart of that. And I think they go deep, really. You think about down to the thing I talk about a lot, which is we want to influence our customers' behavior. And your example earlier about reviewing sizing charts is a great example. Metrics help us focus on that. And one of my other kind of favorite things is they help us embrace this idea that most ideas don't work. So just going back to our check-ins where they're talking about the things they deliver, the outputs rather than the outcomes, the metrics. When you're focusing on metrics, you learn pretty quickly that the things we're trying are not working. Yeah. Whereas if we're doing 6-month projects, not looking at metrics, we don't know that. We don't find out to the end. If we ever find out at all, sometimes we just pretend and we just deliver stuff and move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
So those are some of the jobs to be done as I see them. Any you'd add to that?
Yeah, I think there is. And one of the things that is it's very easy to do when you're having these conversations is see things through the eye of the leadership team, which is often the first team that we get to meet. And obviously, they have a job to be done, which is grow the company, make it more competitive, guide it towards a place where they're going to thrive, not just in the immediate term, but 3, 5, 10 years down the line and be more visionary. But what I really like to do is also see all of these things through the lens of kind of the people that are lower down in the org chart and see it through the eyes of the individual. And one of the things that both of these important planning tools allow us to do is generate purpose. Why are we here? How would we know we're succeeding? How will you know that you're making an impact? How can you help the business? How can you help your team? How can you help yourself? They provide us with an anchor point for that. But there is a flip side to that we probably should talk about, which is with measurement comes accountability, and with accountability comes the idea of potential failure. And I know for certain that you see this, and we've seen it recently with a customer as well, where you can be either rationally or irrationally fearful of what we're talking about today, which is a world where metrics, KPIs, and good OKRs, i.e. they're describing an outcome that is desirable and measurable, which means that we are in the position where we could fail, is normalized within a company.
Yeah, that's a really tricky journey for individuals and for companies, to be honest. And being empathetic, I can see why, because if we're measured on the stuff we produce, and whether we deliver a feature, whether we deliver a new feature for our product, or let's say we had a new payment system, system to our website. Pat on the back, you've done it. And if we turn that around and actually say, okay, what we really want to do is we want to be accountable for results.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, there's a lot more transparency about what you achieve, and the chance of failure being known about. So I talked about the idea of projects going on for 9 months and no one knows if they achieved anything. And that's comfortable for people because whether failure is represented in time, it's not represented in the outcomes for the business. So I think this is something that makes people uncomfortable, essentially because it's the unknown, because we're moving from a situation where I talk to you, let's say I'm your manager, and you tell me I did A, B, and C. I go, great, well done. And next week, D, E, and F. When we turn it around and say, yeah, your job, Matt, is to sell more, is to sell more, is to get a website selling more garments, that's harder. I mean, business outcomes are harder. So I think this idea of accountability is uncomfortable for some people, especially if you've not been there before. I think, love to hear kind of your thoughts on that topic as well. But I understand why people find it uncomfortable. But from a business, it's essential, in my opinion.
And this is where I think you need to bring various stakeholders along for the ride. And it's where I think ambiguity is the enemy of success here. If we just go away on an initiative and launch OKRs, we improve metric maturity, we introduce this idea of accountability and tracking and all of the things that come with that, yet we do not provide clarity on how success will be measured, the retrospective process where we will value learning, not only results, where we can acquire more than just a measurable success, because we might have, created a hypothesis and learned how to do something, or we might have deferred the benefit of something we've achieved to further down the track. And what we're really valuing is more of an attitude, the ability to innovate, the ability to learn, the ability to collaborate in a team. It's how we approach the problem. It's all of the other softer cultural traits, not just the hard numbers. And unless you explain that, unless you lead by example, unless you show how that's going to work, people will default to a position of, you can only ever assume that this is going to impact me, my career, my family, my ability to pay my mortgage, and many other things, because your human nature is to fill in the gaps. So one of the things that we find ourselves doing is providing clarity on what is normally left to be ambiguous. And that does mean talking about, HR, that does mean education, that does mean answering the questions that are sometimes difficult to answer, and working with people to take them on that journey too. And they probably won't believe it until they experience it as well. Until you've missed an OKR, or an experiment has gone wrong, and you realize that actually through how we dealt with that and how we then absorbed the learning, recalibrated and kicked on, and and you make that a positive experience, you won't believe it anyway. So this is why that kind of in-cycle support, as you work through this, it's not just a new way of working, it's a new way of thinking. It's a new way of learning. It's a new way of even thinking about what success looks like at all levels, down to that individual level for me.
Yeah, I think you've touched on some really great points there about it's a cultural, it's not just replacing milestones on project plans with metrics. It's about changing the culture of a business. It's about changing the conversation in a business. And one of the things we haven't really touched enough on today, I think, is the job of metrics in the scope of learning.
Yes.
And it's about learning together. And thinking about the metrics relationships that we talked about earlier, it's about learning those relationships and understanding the strength and building a confidence in those relationships. And when you frame what you're trying to do as learn, I think that helps people understand how this journey is not necessarily going to be a bad thing for them. Helps take away that fear. But also the other point you made about leading by example. I think when leaders share their failures and their mistakes, I heard there's a great discussion where there is no bad strategy, there is only bad execution, which is, I think, completely nonsense. I think sometimes leaders have to stand up and say, yeah, we thought this strategy would work, we gave it a good crack, but it just didn't.
Yes.
When
absolutely.
leaders open their kimono and admit to failing, it becomes a lot easier for people to embrace this kind of accountability culture, and also to take bigger risks, which often lead to bigger rewards.
Yes.
I'm not saying you do that all the time, but yeah. So it's a big picture. It's not just suddenly numbers are part of the business.
And I think that's, again, it's another version of maturity when you have leaders that know that the strategy that they've formulated and have articulated is nothing more than a reasoned hypothesis on how they're going to win a specific group of customers with a specific sort of level of value exchange that are going to allow them to compete on an unlevel playing field, because that's obviously that idea of advantage is what you're trying to achieve. And you're going to be developing those, important capabilities that give you that advantage as part of that kind of narrative. But it is, it's all very reasoned and very logical, but it is a hypothesis. And that's where you sort of start to touch on strategy not being that kind of annualized in January, 2 weeks, on an away event idea. And actually it is more adaptive, it is more fluid. We are able to stop our strategy or evolve it in the same way OKRs are that entity too. In the same way, metrics are also fluid, the relationships, the influence, how we conceive them, what we track and why. This is all very fluid, agile, and adaptive. And if we see it as anything other than that, that's where the issues arise for me.
Yeah, and it's just one anecdote from me when I was a strategist at GlaxoSmithKline many years ago, and I did exactly what you're talking about there. The strategies I produced with my team and colleagues was something that we did once a year, once every 6 months, and you could almost write them in stone because they weren't adaptive, they didn't learn, didn't necessarily have metrics that informed them either.
Yeah.
And we're moving away, well, hopefully long moved away from that kind of thinking, and the kind of support we're trying to give is all around this kind of learning at all levels of the organization.
Yeah.
That adaptation.
So I think, if you're a business leader or a team manager listening to this, what I think I would like you to take out of this is both of these entities, KPIs, metrics, OKRs. It's a journey you need to go on. So what does that journey look like? You're really going from at the sort of the lower end, that idea that you have no real clarity on the levers that you're trying to leverage, to you really understand how your business, the team, your area of operations, how that works and what you need to leverage in order to influence those lagging indicators. And how that plays out on a kind of goal setting basis is you're less likely to track activities, and you're going to generate some proper outcomes. And it's incredibly important if you're going to sort of be able to say we set goals well. And if you can do that, then you can track progress from week to week, probably frequently, and that keeps us accountable, it keeps us focused, it keeps us engaged. And then you can see the impact. You can see the impact of our experiments, of our projects, of our big milestones that we're trying to achieve. We can see the impact of the capabilities that we've decided intentionally to develop in order to give us that advantage. But I think then the softer stuff that, I'm always a fan of, which is, we're moving from a position when we can do that of removing internal conflict. Because what I'm seeing more and more, particularly in teams like marketing and their relationship with finance teams and CEOs, for example, is there's a lot of frustration because the lack of tracking and metric capabilities, the lack of attribution, the lack of understanding of even what that team does and its complexity creates a conflict that's not healthy for the business and those relationships, and is actually detrimental to all shareholder value. And it's not even just limited to marketing. So if we want healthy relationships between leadership, teams, employees, you've got to go on this journey, and it is a journey. And I think in the context of OKRs and KPIs, if you want to get really good at OKRs, it really does depend on how good you are willing to get at KPIs and metrics.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, I think, about organizations who start using OKRs without this foundational understanding of metrics. And maybe the first cycle, that people have got a couple of metrics to hand and it comes easily. But over time, it gets progressively more and more difficult because they're kind of wandering around with a torch in the woods, looking for the next, okay, how do I start to measure this bit? Whereas, when you've got maturity with metrics and you've got a set of KPIs that you're measuring frequently, you can start to build that picture, and it grows and builds and adapts over time. I mean, one of the things to not forget about your metrics is that they're your guess at the world. They're a model of the world. They're wrong, but it's useful. It's a useful model.
Yeah.
And yeah, when you come in and you must have seen those examples where how do we measure that? Because of no foundation in metrics, organizations are really struggling. Absolutely.
And there are mechanisms for dealing with all of this, right? Well, first of all, you've got to have intent and commitment to wanting to mature in both of these areas.
Mm-hmm.
It's not uncommon for one of your first OKRs at least to be geared around achieving some level of metric maturity and the planning milestones that are needed in order to do that, if it's seen as strategically important to the business's success. And I'm hoping if you're listening to this, you're going, well, actually, it is fundamental to your level of competitiveness, your culture, how we treat staff, how we engage people, how we develop talent, how we onboard people. It's it's one of those business fundamentals if you want to achieve a level of excellence. So it, and then you've obviously got if you do find your early OKRs not having the metrics that you want, you can go through exercises like baselining. So coaching provides a lot of different mechanisms and methods of getting to where we're describing. So you shouldn't be put off. It doesn't take many months or quarters to get there, but it does start with intent.
Yeah, and I think about all change in organizations, intent is right at the top of the list. If you don't have the will to go on a journey to achieve some different capability, you're starting with almost zero chance of success. And that intent needs to come across the leadership team. It's no good just coming from the CEO or the chief product officer or chief marketing. Everyone needs to embrace it because it's a completely different way of thinking. And to make that kind of deep change requires real intent, I believe.
Yeah. So if we were to sort of summarize and think about what are the kind of key points we'd like people to take out from this chat, I think I would start by saying it's a prerequisite to intend to achieve metric and OKR maturity by investing in both. And when I think about that, one of the questions I often ask people is, if you were to grade yourself out of 10 as to how good you are today, it is common to have the answer 4, 5, or 6 come out in both of these areas. And in my head, the real plan should be get to 8, 9, 10. That's how good you should aim to become because of the material impact it will have on your business.
Yeah, I agree. This kind of idea of them, you can invest in one or not the other, just doesn't make sense to me. But also learn it is respect that it is a journey. You're not going to get to 8, 9, or 10 in 2 months. You are going to see some much better insights. You're going to trip up on some hurdles, but slowly over time, you're going to understand what the levers are in your business. You'll understand this bigger picture. You won't be wandering the trees with a torch. You'll have an overview, and you'll be able to say, well, strategically, there looks like there's a big opportunity to really make an improvement in this area. And the metrics are showing you the levers. They're telling you where your OKRs can be. It's
absolutely
incredibly powerful.
And what we see is it's very common for there to be variable levels of maturity within an organization. For example, sales, because of CRM systems, etc., tend to be better than most teams. Marketing can be hit and miss. Product can be hit and miss. So I think the idea that we're all at the same standard, even within the company, is not true, but we should all want to level up that standard throughout the company, because having one team that's heavily biased towards tracking kind of productivity because we've not forced them to mature their metric capability is both probably a bit unfair, and also it's basically saying that's okay, and I don't think we are saying that's okay.
No, and one extra dimension I'd add to that is it's also that level of maturity can vary over time. As a product team, as an example, you can be working in a core area of your product where you know it very well, and you can know the metrics pretty well. You decide you need to move into a different domain, and that maturity evaporates overnight. You have to go and build the model again. You have to go and build that understanding again. It's not a one and done thing.
And I think the kind of how will you know that you're kind of feeling the full force of all of this? First thing I think for me is you'd recognize it as being part of your culture. If you had to describe what type of company you are, you'd really say, we're heavily into metrics. We're heavily into really sort of planning well. We know all the different levers and how each team operates. We all have purpose. We know whether we're succeeding. We're learning fast. We are innovative, and it becomes part of your kind of standard business operations. And that's what we're really aiming for here. It's not a new initiative. It's not a new way of working. It's just how you work.
Yeah, and you hear it. It's in the conversations. When I've worked with, I'm sure you too. When you work with an organization, and the conversations are always about when is feature X going to be delivered, and they change to how confident are we're going to achieve our business goals? When you hear that, you realize that kind of cultural change is happening. It's amazing when you hear a CEO kind of stop themselves and ask a different question and kind of probe in a different way. It's so powerful. It's amazing when you hear that change.
And a question that goes with that is, what do you need? When you are talking about progress and confidence and risk and delays, bottlenecks, blockers, whatever we want to call these things that come up, what do you need is a proactive, positive conversation that can be supported, as opposed to being sandbagged, obfuscated, etc. And I think these are, again, all of those behaviors are actually rooted in culture.
Yeah, and I'm sure a topic for another day, but the whole idea of kind of leaders setting context and being servant leaders who are there to help everyone else succeed is a great topic in itself.
What was meant to be a very short fireside chat, we've gone down quite deep into lots of areas there, but I think we've probably addressed the KPI versus OKR question. Hopefully the people listening will have some clarity on that, and hopefully they find that useful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Enjoyed the chat. Thanks, Matt.
All right. You take care.